architect working in a whole range of different projects. I worked on projects in private practice in Vancouver doing high-end residential. I also worked doing projects like remote villages for fly-in, fly-out miners in far north Queensland. And also my favourite, I also worked on the first giant panda exhibit in the Southern Hemisphere, which was most enjoyable. All that was in private practice, and about 18 months ago I made a small but not insignificant shift into the public sector. And I'm not embarrassed to say that I spent about the first month in a metaphorical fetal position, wondering what was actually going on. I didn't understand the language, I didn't understand the rules, couldn't work out what was actually happening around me. But eventually I realised that in government, and in most of what we do, what gets measured matters. And we measure all sorts of things in government. We measure really easy, very tangible things about us, ourselves. We measure our own performance. We also measure the performance of our leaders in their success or otherwise in a very short time period. We also measure cities. We measure it by GDP. We measure it by really simple demographics that we can find from census data. We also measure things like energy use. We also set targets for ourselves that we can then also measure. And the thing about targets is, if I pick one from that's relevant today, which is creating a more vibrant city, we often set targets like, let's get more people to come and live in Adelaide, or let's get more people to come and invest here, or work here, or play here, or whatever it might be. But we also all know that just getting people to come and live here isn't necessarily a target that will deliver a more vibrant city or a way that we actually want to live. It's a much more complex situation than just hitting individual targets. So for the purpose of today, I've chosen two cities to consider. I've chosen Adelaide, Australia, because this is where I'm growing my family and have chosen to live. And I'm also going to compare it to Dhaka in Bangladesh, where my sister-in-law is growing her family. So last year, the Economic Intelligence Unit rated Adelaide as the 5th most livable city in the world, which is pretty exciting to know that I already lived here. It's also really exciting because we shot up. We're now more livable than Sydney and getting closer to Melbourne. Unfortunately, out of 140 cities, Dhaka actually came 140th. And this is an image from my sister-in-law's 5th floor balcony. And this is in actually a pretty nice part of town. The interesting thing about that particular global livability metric is it considers things like crime rates, quality of education, and also infrastructure. So we do pretty well in Adelaide because we do infrastructure really well. We certainly design for cars pretty successfully. In Dhaka it's a little bit different when some days you can't even make a phone call, and it has pretty poor infrastructure. But then also on the Happy Planet Index, which is also a very well-known global index rating tool for cities, Dhaka actually comes 11th. They've got an amazing respect for their own culture and the way that they celebrate it. Not surprisingly, Australia came 102nd. And what's interesting about that particular indices is that they consider things like your ecological footprint, but they also do something called the ladder of life, where they actually ask people to rate how they're feeling, how happy they are at any particular time. And what's interesting about that is that your own perception of happiness can be quite different regardless of your GDP or the other things like infrastructure that we're rating livable global cities as. There's all sorts of different ways that we can rate a city, and there is many different tools. There's this one, the OECD Better Life Index. There's the Vitality Index. This is just a US one that starts to rate the cultural aspects of a city. There's the Green City Index, one of my favourites, which is a very successful way of rating cities. And then there's even the Quality of Life Survey by Monocle, which I call the hipster rating tool. And it always puts Melbourne pretty high up. Sorry, Nick. And then there's a couple that actually government uses all the time, the really serious ones, this one being the Human Development Reports, and they use this to actually work out where they're going to fund major projects and apply aid and the like. But then there's one that I'm really interested in. How do you rate a city just through social media or your own networks and friends? This guy, Marty of Phuket, also responds and says that Thailand is safer. He feels safer in Thailand than he actually does walking in the streets of Melbourne, the 6th most livable city in the world. And then there's a whole lot of, I should point out that then there's the one from the scenery down below, my friends on Radio Adelaide, that actually talk about their rating of cultural vitality in Adelaide, and we're probably not doing as well as maybe what some other people think we are. And now you see a whole plethora of different programs and tools that private practice and public sector are developing to capture that social media or that conversation that we have as together. So that they can actually increase the engagement and start to understand a little bit better about what people are saying about cities. So why is it important to measure a city? I think, as we all know, we don't often stay where we were born anymore. People are able to move around more freely. We choose our cities on where we think we're going to have the best time. So media reports around what is the most livable or what is the most enjoyable, or maybe where not to go and live, actually have a big impact, not just on humans, on our lifestyle, but also on business and investment in a particular city. I'd like to think that Adelaide seems where shooting upwards might be very attractive for investors. But then we also make some mistakes. Vancouver, where I used to live, which is actually number 2 in the Green Cities Index, and a really successful city, always sits up there as number 1 or 2 on the most livable cities in the world, is actually just been declared the no-fun city. They've changed a whole lot of their small bar licences and venues and their liquor licensing. They've increased the big box sort of nightclubs on one particular street, which has created some unsocial behaviour. Sounds a bit familiar to Adelaide. And there's even a whole website now that's just dedicated to movies about the no-fun city in Vancouver. So it's really easy if you're just up there at number 1 to drop off it pretty quickly. And this has only happened when I lived there. It was certainly didn't have this situation just 5 years ago. So I wonder if we're actually measuring the right things. Now, I don't develop tools for measuring cities, but there's certainly some people doing some great work, like Andy, a national group who are actually looking at more holistic ways of measuring the city for wellbeing. And what I'd like to propose today is, what if we address that challenge a little bit differently? And what if we addressed it from green infrastructure? When I was considering today's content and I was thinking about green infrastructure, it's a terrible word for something that's actually really exciting. It doesn't really have much impact as a human being, the idea of green infrastructure. So I thought it still might be a good idea to use green infrastructure as a lens to consider what might be the right solutions to Adelaide. And I have 3 propositions that are very specific to this city. The first one being maybe we could use the platypus as a KPI for the health and biodiversity of our river that we all care about so much. Maybe using the platypus as a metaphor. Ironically, we discovered during some work that we've been doing recently that platypus actually don't mind where they swim. They actually quite like it in brown muddy water. But as a metaphor for biodiversity, maybe it would have quite a different impact on not just the way that we design or treat the riverbank, but maybe it would be an interesting way to consider how we treat the water before it even gets to the river. Maybe it would encourage us to use more water-sensitive urban design. Maybe it would encourage us to think about how we use water ourselves, so that we can keep biodiversity as the key indicator of our waterways. It also might be a way to actually think about what else is important to us about the river. Maybe a brown muddy river that's returned to its original format isn't actually what we want for a city river. So maybe the opportunity to actually have crystal blue water might be part of that same conversation for a pool in the River Torrens. My second proposition is around the humble bee. And imagine what our city would look like if we actually said a bee doesn't have to travel more than 20 metres for its food source. As you know, bees are actually our life force. They sustain us, they pollinate our plants and our food. Without bees, we would be living very, very differently to what we are now. This is a picture from Vancouver, and this is the Olympic Village that was just designed and installed less than 2 years ago. Right in the middle of a 3 million people city, they've actually created space for biodiversity and actually placed biodiversity at the forefront of the actual site. This is some work that was done by HASSELL late last year, where they actually looked at maybe ranking the importance of our parklands at the same level as we do our roads. So could you actually have a biodiversity network that isn't intersected by our 8-lane roadways across the parklands? And this makes me think also about things like maybe we need to reconsider our street trees. Maybe we could get more continuous street trees. I certainly know that we've tended to move away from street trees that have fruiting trees because of maintenance issues. Certainly we've moved away from using large trees as street trees. And maybe there's an opportunity to rethink whether we at least have flowering trees to keep a corridor for bees. Also interesting in that site in Vancouver was that they've actually made a place on a post-industrial site where they actually have habitat for their native animal, the Canadian geese. And that's really important. I know a lot of people sort of laugh when you think about whether we should be trying to encourage koalas or our native animals into the city. I think it's really important when you consider the size of the site here in Vancouver. Maybe it would even change the way that we write briefs for our built environment. Maybe we can consider this at Adelaide Zoo here. Maybe we could consider actually doing something like they did, where they actually said there should be no net loss of habitat by actually building that built environment. And maybe even we can start using our older infrastructure, our unused infrastructure, just like the High Line in New York, like Highway number 1, all the way from Brisbane through to Adelaide. Maybe in the future could be used for biodiversity, wildlife corridors. It's a great infrastructure that we already have. And my third proposition is around the city's urban heat island effect, and considering what we could do if we understood what's currently invisible as a more visible and tangible measure of what we're doing every day. We know in Adelaide that we get about a 3 to a 6% degree change in our urban heat throughout the day, just based on our car use and the operation of our city, which is really significant because we're also getting not just hotter days, but we're getting hotter nights. And hotter nights are really worth thinking about because, and these figures are taken from the year of the bushfires in Victoria, there was actually far more deaths because of heat through that particular hot summer than there was from the catastrophe of the bushfires. Some work that Graham Hopkins has been doing with Flinders University and one of our government departments has actually started putting probes around the city, and they're really measuring now exactly where that heat bubble exists. And they've learnt that when combined with our very unique gully wind that comes down from the Adelaide Hills, we actually see a shift of our heat bubble just across slightly right on top of where the new hospital is being built, and then further into our parklands, which is really not insignificant when you consider that the hospital is going to have to work extra hard to mitigate the impact that it's inheriting. So again, maybe when you consider this as a measure or an indicator, maybe we can start considering how cities can not only adapt to mitigate urban heat island effect, but also maybe they can be adaptive throughout the day. So when we've got our highest heat island bubble, maybe buildings can actually transform in different ways to mitigate the impact. And I wanted to include this beautiful project from two French artists called Hihi, and this is the Green Cloud project that was done in Helsinki a few years ago. And what it looked at was actually how you create behaviour change just by being able to see the impact of your energy use in the city. This is quite interesting because what they did was they lit up their smokestack. The more energy the city was collectively using at any time became visible, and it actually resulted in a change in behaviour. Maybe we need to be able to see our urban heat island effect instead of it actually just being invisible. So as we move in the next few years, 20 years or 30 years, into 20 more million people living in Australia, and we certainly think about how we're actually going to live in that increased population. And maybe whether it's just business as usual, or maybe it's actually something really quite radically different from where we are today, what we need to do is think about how we measure our human input into our cities and the things that we really value, and how can we actually measure those values so that we can get more tangible outcomes rather than things like GDP that might not necessarily affect our daily lives. Thank you.